Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Pharisee briefing, chapter 4. Sorry it's taking so long for this follow-up to the previous chapter, but it actually is a very opportune moment because just a couple of days ago, it's now July 8th, 2008, and just a couple of days ago a news story hit the internet about a stone tablet that was translated from ancient Hebrew. It's found in Israel. And it contains a prophecy which dates back at least 100 years before the birth of Jesus. And this prophecy states that a coming Messiah will emerge who, among other things, will die and be resurrected 3 days after his death. It does not say 2 days, or 2 weeks, or 4 days, or it doesn't leave an indeterminate amount of time as certain other predictions may have or did in the past. It speaks precisely of 3 days. Now, what makes this important? 2 things. First of all, if you've heard the expression carved in stone, these tablets were hand carved out of stone, whereas most of the religious documentation that's been recovered from that area of the world were handwritten on parchment, which was much simpler, much cheaper. And the parchment was then rolled up and put into clay vases, and the tops were sealed with wax, and these things were then buried in caves, some of which survived and became the Dead Sea Scrolls, and others, for a variety of reasons, didn't make it and just became dust. Anyway, this particular prophecy was carved in stone, which made it obviously more important than a lot of the other materials that has been recovered from that area. And at first impression, some religious Christians might rejoice and say, you see, well, this proves that the story is true. In fact, it doesn't prove that the story itself is true. What it proves is that the story was prophesied at least 100 years before Jesus was born. And what makes that important is much of the modern Christian liturgy believes that Jesus invented his own religion, that he was half human and half God, and he not only spoke for God, but he spoke as God, and brought these revelations to humanity. So now with the discovery of these stone tablets, now calls into question how much of his religion was existed before he was born, or, just as importantly, B, was later subsequently modified for political reasons by the Romans or various Vatican factions since the early part of the Gregorian calendar. But it also really cements the theory that the early Christians were an offshoot of an existing religious sect in Judaism known as the Essenes. And the Essenes, if you remember from my last chapter, were a group of very devout Jews who lived in the desert. They forswore any luxuries. They only owned the robes that they wore. One set of white robes were all that they owned. They were strict vegetarians. They were strict pacifists. They could not even touch a knife, certainly not possess such a thing. The idea of self-defense was to them no excuse for violence, which they banned. And they were also communists. Now, keep in mind that the concept is a little bit foggy, because today, for someone to be a communist would really mean that they'd have to give up their right to private property. Going back then, there wasn't so much private property to own to begin with. There wasn't so much to give up. It wasn't such a big fundamental decision, but nonetheless, they shared equally everything that the group had, and they not only shared amongst themselves, but they were generous and shared with people outside their own community. It is my personal belief, which this is not a new belief I have, but it's been reinforced by the most recent news story I referenced. It's my personal belief that Jesus was an offshoot, a splinter group from the Essene monastery. And I'll tell you where I think they were the same, and I'll tell you where I think they were different. Keeping in mind that Jesus' brother, named James, was the leader of the Essene monastery. That in itself is slightly curious because Jesus was the older brother. And the older brother, from a religious perspective, had certain rights in the Jewish tradition, which it would seem to me that Jesus would have had to have pretty much given up his position, or decided not to assume the position of the leadership of the Essene sect and left it for his younger brother James. I think that there were quite a few similarities. I think they drew on the same background materials, the same traditions. I think where Jesus departed from the Essenes was on the following points. Number one, I think it was Jesus' motivation to include all peoples of the world, whereas the Essenes had been fairly self-contained and isolationist. They did not necessarily believe in spreading their religion around. I think that the Jesus movement, or the early Christians, elevated the position of women, because the Essenes were completely male-dominated. The women were nearly, almost, accidental to their lifestyle. And I think that Jesus had intended to level the playing field somewhat. It is my belief that Mary Magdalene was a full disciple of his, with all the rights, privileges, and authority of all the other disciples. It's further my belief that the early Holy Roman Empire, the early Catholic Church, wrongly cast this Mary Magdalene as a prostitute in order to discredit her and return women in general to their marginalized position. I also lastly think that Jesus was willing to depart somewhat from the dietary laws in order to accommodate the fact that he wanted to bring non-Jews into the movement. He knew that that would not be possible if the rule was insisted upon that they stay strictly kosher. But those people, and I'm going to wrap this up now because I'm running out of time, those people who believe that Jesus was a pork-eating, circumcised capitalist who would have, if he lived today, promoted the concept as we have in the United States, where 2% of the population own 100% of the equity and 98% of the population own 100% of the debt. That is clearly not supported by history. Furthermore, whether Jesus was a total pacifist or not, I am completely convinced that he would not have approved of nuclear weaponry. Here are people that would not pick up. They believed that God was going to do battle for them, that they did not have to soil their hands. So feel free to believe what you like. It's your human right to do so. I'm just trying to report the facts. Thank you for watching.